Julia Kim. These are your headlines. The UK moves a step closer to blocking a no-deal Brexit at the end of October. This after the House of Lords gives the green light for the bill to go through Parliament. We'll go to Brussels for the latest with our correspondent Dave Keating. At least 20 people have died in the Bahamas after the devastation wrought by Hurricane Dorian. The UN says 70,000 people are in need of immediate humanitarian relief. And Iran rolls back on another commitment under the 2015 nuclear agreement. Tehran says it will increase uranium enrichment, but it also says it will give the EU more time to salvage the deal. Also coming up this hour, we'll tell you why Chernobyl has become the latest go-to destination for tourists. And in business, as the US and China agree to restart trade talks, we'll find out how their dispute is impacting the technology industry ahead of a major electronics show in Berlin. But first, the UK appears to be a step closer to blocking a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. In the early hours of Thursday, the House of Lords agreed to all stages of the bill to stop a no-deal would be complete in the upper house by 5 p.m. Friday. Now, this would clear the way for the bill to receive royal assent by Monday, meaning it could become law before Parliament is suspended. Now, it comes after UK MPs handed Boris Johnson his third defeat in 2 days. Maria Sophos has the story.
After British MPs voted resoundingly in favour of a bill spearheaded by the opposition that would delay Brexit and halt a no-deal outcome, Prime Minister Boris Johnson responded with a request for a snap election, which was swiftly rejected by the House of Commons. The Prime Minister pointed the finger at Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn.
I think he has become the first, to my knowledge, the first leader of the opposition in the democratic history of our country to refuse the invitation to an election. The obvious conclusion is, I'm afraid, that he does not think he will win.
Johnson unreservedly declared his government's opposition to a further delay, yet both Jeremy Corbyn and third-party leader Joe Swinson said that an election could only be considered if the delay bill becomes law.
Let this bill pass and gain royal assent, then we will back an election so we do not crash out with a no-deal exit from the European Union.
So if he wants an election, extend Article 50 for the purposes of having a general election and bring it on.
The bill's fate is still unsure. It now has to pass through the UK's upper house. Pro-Brexit peers in the House of Lords are threatening to try to stop it by filibustering until time runs out. Johnson insists Britain must leave the EU on October 31st with or without a deal, and he accused the opposition of trying to overturn what he called the biggest democratic vote in UK history.
That's Maria Sophos there with that report. Let's cross live now to our correspondent Dave Keating in Brussels for all the reaction from the continent. Now, Dave, what has the EU made of yesterday's drama in the British Parliament?
Well, there's been no official reaction yet to Johnson's call for a snap election. But of course, yesterday we already knew that was the likely outcome. And EU officials were really reacting to exasperation to this idea of having an election on October 15th, just 2 days before that critical EU summit here in Brussels that will determine whether the UK and the EU go into a no-deal scenario. As one EU official put it to me, the sequencing makes no sense here, because if Boris Johnson were to win that election and have a Conservative majority in the parliament, his idea is he would come here to Brussels and say, look, my new parliament has cancelled what the old parliament did. Now no deal is back on the table. Take that backstop arrangement out, or I will pull the trigger on this and we will go into no deal. The problem is that within 2 days, it won't really be clear whether all of his Conservative MPs would indeed vote to take that no-deal prevention legislation off the table. The alternative scenario, if Jeremy Corbyn's Labour were to win the election, the idea is that Jeremy Corbyn would come here to Brussels and ask for an extension. But what is he asking an extension for? The EU has said that it would only grant an extension in the event of a general election or a second referendum, essentially. Something material has to change. Now, Corbyn has promised a second referendum, but it's unclear whether all his Labour MPs would support that, and it probably won't be clear within just 2 days. And of course, a general election will have just happened, so he can't call another one. So really, the EU agrees with the opposition's assessment that an election should take place after October 31st, after a request for an extension.
Now, the opposition, of course, have pointed out that the PM has really put zero new proposals to replace Theresa May's withdrawal deal. I mean, is Boris Johnson really overselling his hand? Because he's promising that he can come back from Brussels with something new on the table.
Yeah, this has really perplexed EU officials, because here in Brussels there is absolutely no sign of any real good faith negotiation. Yesterday, David Frost, Johnson's new Brexit negotiator, came here to Brussels, but he didn't even meet with Michel Barnier. Instead, Barnier spent the day meeting with the Brexit Steering Committee, making preparations for no-deal Brexit. Really, from the EU side, they say they've heard no new ideas from Johnson about what could replace that backstop arrangement, which the EU still insists is absolutely essential. And so there's increasing suspicion here in Brussels that what Johnson is doing is just trying to run out the clock, pretending to have negotiations, but really he just wants to get to that summit on the 17th of October and say, look, we had negotiations and nothing worked. Of course, they would say negotiations didn't really happen. And I have permission to have a no deal. I'm going to have a no deal unless you drop that backstop. The idea is that he would intimidate the EU into dropping the backstop and agreeing to a deal to avert the potential chaos of no deal. The problem is really the going wisdom here in Brussels is that the EU would rather choose no deal, which will, economists say, affect the UK much more than the EU, than to drop that backstop. Johnson seems to think that they would lose their nerve at the last minute, but it's hard to envision that happening. It's a risky gambit on his part, and that's exactly what the current parliament wants to avoid. They're saying that this is an irresponsible strategy to have no-deal Brexit on the table as a threat, and they want to take it off the table.
Dave Keating there. Dave Keating, thank you very much. Dave Keating reporting to us there from Brussels. Well, let's move on now. And at least 20 people have died in the Bahamas from the devastation wrought by Hurricane Dorian. The US Coast Guard and Britain's Royal Navy airlifted survivors and ferried in emergency supplies. Now, according to the UN, some 70,000 people on the Grand Bahama and Abaco Islands are in immediate need of aid. Brian Quinn has the latest.
Unprecedented devastation in the Bahamas. Entire neighborhoods wiped off the map in the wake of Hurricane Dorian. Helicopters from the U.S. Coast Guard and the British Royal Navy airlifted injured survivors out on Wednesday, as Prime Minister Hubert Minnis thanked the international community for its support and vowed to carry on.
Our response will be day and night, day after day, week after week, month after month, until the lives of our people return to some degree of normalcy.
In the capital, Nassau, tearful reunions as families found missing relatives. The United Nations now says some 70,000 people need immediate humanitarian aid. The Red Cross estimates that 13,000 homes have been either severely damaged or completely destroyed. Residents shocked at the level of damage.
Nothing's there anymore. There's no food stores, there's no marinas, there's no houses. 80% of the houses gone.
Yeah. Hardest hit, the northernmost islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama. Dorian struck there Sunday night with winds gusting over 350 kilometers per hour, tying the record for the strongest Atlantic hurricane to ever make landfall. Storm surges of up to 7 meters submerged entire houses as the storm lingered over the islands for 2 days before weakening and heading north. But Dorian is now regaining strength over the warm waters off the coast of the southeastern U.S. Over 2.2 million people have been ordered to evacuate in Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas.
Now, Hurricane Dorian has strengthened to a Category 3 storm and is threatening to flood low-lying coasts from Georgia to southwest Virginia. Now, the storm is packing winds of 185 kilometers an hour as it moves up the Carolinas, with the National Hurricane Center warning that life-threatening storm surges of up to 2.5 meters are expected in the next few days. South Carolina's state governor has ordered 800,000 people living along the coast to evacuate. Now, Iran on Wednesday announced they will stop restricting nuclear research and development. The move is the latest rollback of Tehran's commitments under the 2015 nuclear agreement, and it came ahead of a deadline set by Tehran this Thursday for European partners to come up with a method of easing Iran's economic situation. But that task has been made more difficult by Washington, which announced further sanctions on Wednesday. Alison Sargent reports.
Iranian President Hassan Rouhani had good news and bad news for his remaining nuclear deal partners. He's giving European powers another 2 months to try and save the pact, but in the meantime, he'll be launching a third phase in scaling back Iran's commitments.
We will make advances in research and development in the field of centrifuges, various types of new centrifuges, and whatever we need for uranium enrichment.
Rouhani already abandoned 2 of the deal's other commitments in July, when he stopped limiting Iran's nuclear stockpile and began enriching uranium beyond an agreed level of purity. Washington, meanwhile, has been continuing their campaign of sanctions, and on Wednesday announced new ones, blacklisting what they called an oil for terror network of firms, ships, and people it suspects of ties to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. The U.S. says they are committed to their strategy of maximum pressure. Still, Donald Trump says he's open to meeting Rouhani at the UN General Assembly later this month.
Anything's possible. They would like to be able to solve their problem. They got a big problem. They're getting killed financially. They have tremendous potential, and I think they're going to want to take advantage of that potential. I really believe that.
Rouhani has already ruled out a meeting until the U.S. eases sanctions. France, meanwhile, continues its mediation efforts and has proposed a $15 billion credit line to Iran if they return to full compliance with the 2015 accord. But the U.S. would need to approve such a deal, and so far Washington has not given a clear response.
Hundreds of people in Argentina have protested outside the Social Development Ministry in Buenos Aires. Now, those who marched came out to show their anger at high inflation and demand government action to what they say is a national food crisis. Erin Ogunki has this report.
Another desperate plea to the Argentine government. Hundreds of people demonstrated against austerity measures in Buenos Aires on Wednesday, with social groups demanding the government respond to what they say is a nascent food crisis.
I see that everyone's concerned about sending messages to the markets, to the sectors of power, and very few are moved by the hunger in the neighborhoods. Very few are moved by the social situation. The workers, even if they have a job, don't make it to the end of the month and are below the poverty line.
The consequences of Argentina's financial crisis have deepened in recent months. Inflation is expected to hit 55% by the end of the year, and nearly a third of the population lives below the poverty line. The peso had also lost around a fifth of its value since the August 11th primary election, when President Mauricio Macri was thrashed by populist-leaning opponent Alberto Fernandez, now the front-runner ahead of the October general elections. In response, Macri imposed currency controls earlier this week, sending many to the banks to withdraw cash. In a speech to business leaders on Wednesday, the Argentine president admitted the government has made mistakes in its response to the crisis.
As president, my goal is to reduce vulnerability and be able to bring calm to all Argentines. In these years, we've surely made mistakes and made forecasts that did not become reality, and we will have time to debate during the campaign about those mistakes and the things we've learned.
Still, experts warn the economic situation only risks getting worse. Economists have lowered the 2020 growth forecast, suggesting a deeper recession than originally expected.
And now this news just in. A large explosion has rocked the Afghan capital and smoke is rising from a part of eastern Kabul near a neighborhood housing the US Embassy and other diplomatic missions. A spokesperson for Kabul's police chief says the blast occurred in the city's 9th police district. The blast taking place this Thursday morning as a US envoy has been in the capital briefing the Afghan government and others on a deal he says has been reached, quote, in principle with the Taliban on ending America's longest war. Now, the hit TV series Chernobyl has turned the nuclear disaster zone into a new tourist destination. The 1986 blast spewed radiation over a vast swathe of Europe, and a 30-kilometre exclusion zone remains in place around the plant in Ukraine. But a small part of it is open to a growing number of visitors, with tour operators expecting 100,000 people this year. Last month, Ukraine's new president signed a decree to develop the site further as a tourist attraction. But guides say many are more interested in taking selfies than learning about the accident. Now, a quick reminder of our top stories this hour. The UK moves a step closer to blocking a no-deal Brexit at the end of October. This after the House of Lords gives the green light for the bill to go through Parliament. At least 20 people have been confirmed dead in the Bahamas after the devastation wrought by Hurricane Dorian. The UN says 70,000 people are in need of immediate humanitarian relief. And Iran rolls back on another commitment under the 2015 nuclear agreement. Tehran says it will increase uranium enrichment, but it also says it will give the EU more time to salvage the deal. Well, let's take a look at the day's business news now and possible signs of progress in resolving the trade dispute between the US and China. Our business editor, Stephen Carroll, is here with more. Stephen.
Julia, after the escalation of recent weeks, relations do seem to be thawing between Beijing and Washington. The two sides have agreed to high-level talks next month. Now, this announcement came after a phone call between China's Vice Premier and the US Treasury Secretary and Trade Representative. Chinese and American officials will begin discussions in the coming weeks. We shouldn't hold our breath for any immediate breakthroughs, though. The sides had been close to an agreement in April before the talks fell apart. After meetings in August failed to yield any results, the US labelled China a currency manipulator and imposed fresh tariffs of 15% on over $100 billion worth of Chinese imports. Now, in addition to that, President Trump has threatened to increase the tariff from 25% to 30% on another $250 billion worth of Chinese imports. And further still, in December, there could be a new 15% tariff on another $150 billion worth of goods. With that threat of further escalation hovering over the world's two largest economies, it's perhaps unsurprising that the markets are relieved that new talks are going to take place. In Asia today, we've seen gains across the board on news of those meetings planned for October. The Nikkei in Tokyo finishing the day up over 2%, Shanghai up 1.6% as well. So gains on the markets there as a result of that. The trade tensions, though, are also hanging over a major technology showcase that kicks off in Berlin. At the IFA Consumer Electronics Show, smartphone manufacturers are conscious that their products could be hit by tariffs. China's Huawei is facing particular challenges, as Catherine Kadir-Clifford reports.
Tensions in the air ahead of this year's Berlin Tech Show as companies fret over the US-China trade war. The company which looks set to take the hardest hit, Chinese telecoms giant Huawei. US sanctions have banned American businesses from working with the company, putting its latest smartphone on the line. With Google blocked from doing business with Huawei, the Chinese giant's been racing to develop its own operating system in time for the planned release later this month.
A few months ago, we saw Harmony OS, which is the OS they've been working on, but running on a TV. They say they're ready to be able to just implement that on a smartphone. But of course, there are other questions that need to be answered. Will there be apps in time? Right now, if they can't get Google, they might not be able to launch that phone.
Smartphones produced in China aren't yet affected by tariffs, though they are set to take a 15% hit from December. But other gadgets like TVs and smartwatches are already targeted. analysts say it's creating a climate of mounting uncertainty in the tech industry.
We're unsure how everyone will weather the trade war, but there will be winners and there will be losers. If we look at Samsung, they've already pulled their manufacturing out of China to Vietnam years ago. So they may be a winner, whereas Huawei and Apple may potentially become losers.
Some 1,800 companies are set to exhibit at the fair, preparing for scrutiny over how their business is faring in the midst of the ongoing trade war.
The Brexit drama continues in London. Let's check in on what's happening with the British currency today. The pound tends to be where investors focus their attention as there are major developments in Brexit. Things pretty stable today. The pound trading at $1.22 and €1 at 11 cents. The pound moving off that 3-year low that we saw against the dollar on Tuesday. Google is to pay $170 million to settle claims that YouTube collected children's personal data without their consent. The company was fined by the Federal Trade Commission and accused of baiting kids with content to feed its advertising business. Google has promised to work with video creators to label material for children and limit the data collected from those videos. But campaign groups say the penalty isn't high enough.
The fine is not nearly adequate enough. It should have been in the billions of dollars. That's what would have sent a message to Google. That's what would have prevented future violations. It's interesting that Google didn't even report the fine that was coming to its stockholders because it didn't even see it as affecting the company's bottom line or its stock price.
And finally, for me, the CEO of Nissan is to pay back part of his bonus to the company after auditors found that he'd been given too much money. The auditors found that Hiroto Saiko was overpaid to the tune of $400,000. He's apologised and promised to return the sum, but it comes at a time the company's former chairman, Carlos Ghosn, remains in custody, awaiting trials on charges that he enriched himself with the company money. Mr. Ghosn also denies any wrongdoing. Speaking to journalists, Hiroto Saiko said that the overpayment was linked to a scheme under the Ghosn era. Julia.
Stephen, thank you very much for that business update. Stephen Carroll there. OK, well, the diplomatic fallout from the xenophobic looting in South Africa has continued to escalate. Countries around the continent have warned their citizens over violence that has targeted foreigners living in Johannesburg and Pretoria. At least 7 people have been killed since last Friday. James Asino has the story.
Burning tyres and hurling rocks. Nigerian protesters seek vengeance on South African-owned shops. Authorities across the continent have called for Pretoria to take action following the recent string of xenophobic attacks. Ghana, Kenya and Ethiopia are urging South Africa to ensure their citizens' safety abroad, while the Nigerian government has advised nationals not to travel to the country until the situation is under control. Over in Zambia, as politics spread to football, the country cancelled a friendly set to take place against South Africa. Protesters also took to the streets as many South African businesses remained closed.
Zero to xenophobia! We already got our independence! It's time that we fight these South Africans! It's time xenophobia comes to an end!
Let us uplift the spirit of Pan-Africanism and want to together African cannot kill an African. So students in Zambia have condemned this and we are going to demonstrate to the latter.
Xenophobic violence is on the rise as unemployment has soared. And while 29% of South Africans are without a job, the country remains a major destination for economic migrants.
Now, if you're looking to possibly relocate, The Economist magazine has named Vienna as the world's most livable city. The Austrian capital retains its title for the 2nd consecutive year. Meanwhile, Paris dropped 6 places to 25th this year due to the Yellow Vest movement. Yana Lee has more.
For tourists, Vienna is the city of music, art and architecture. The Austrian capital may be steeped in history, but it takes more to be ranked the world's most livable city. The Economist's annual ranking looks at criteria such as stability, environment, infrastructure and healthcare, and it's crowned Vienna #1 for the 2nd year running.
First of all, I'd like to say that the water quality is great here. It comes straight from the mountains. Crime rates are low too. I'm a cyclist. I'm not at all afraid of cycling at night.
There are so many parks where you can play with your kids, like here, for example.
For the first time, the ranking has taken into account the effects of climate change, noting that air pollution, for example, affects quality of life. New Delhi noticeably dropped 6 spots to 118th this year. Another city that slid down the rankings is Paris, this due to the instability surrounding the Yellow Vest movement. 3 Australian and 3 Canadian cities feature in the top 10, with Toronto and Tokyo in a tie for 7th place. On the other end of the scale, Damascus, Lagos and Dhaka are in the bottom 3 out of the 140 countries surveyed. Civil unrest, terrorism and war affect the score. The Syrian capital has retained the unfortunate title for the past 7 years. Though much of the city is keeping up appearances, entire neighbourhoods in the suburbs have been wiped out.
Well, it's time now for a quick break, but don't go away. There's more news coming up in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
Plants capture CO2. What if industry captured it too? If industrial sites had technology that captured carbon, as trees do, we could help lower Europe's emissions. Carbon capture is important technology, and experts agree. That's why we're working to improve it, so industry can do what plants do.
He is one of the most prolific directors in American cinema, with several masterpieces to his career. Woody Allen's back with A Rainy Day in New York.
You're by far the most interesting American director.
Would you like a scoop? The film is not expected to be released in the US. The directors face backlash with the Me Too movement.
I think if the movie's been being released all over the world, if people enjoy the movie, I think it will eventually be released in the United States.
Scene 19, take 2.
Action! You can watch the full interview as A Rainy Day in New York kicks off the Deauville American Film Festival.
Encore on France 24 and France24.com.
France 24. Every art form.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
8:30 here in the French capital. You're watching live from Paris here on France 24. I'm Julia Kim. These are your headlines. The UK moves a step closer to blocking a no-deal Brexit at the end of October. This after the House of Lords gives the green light for the bill to go through Parliament. And at least 20 people have been confirmed dead in the Bahamas after the devastation wrought by Hurricane Dorian. The UN says 70,000 people are in need of immediate humanitarian relief. And also coming up in the show, are health and happiness just a few thousand steps away? Today's Perspective guest tells us why we should all get walking. Tune in for that interview at 8:40 a.m. Paris time. First, the UK appears to be a step closer to blocking a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. In the early hours of Thursday morning, the House of Lords agreed to all stages of the bill to stop a no-deal would be complete in the upper house by 5 p.m. Friday. Now, this would clear the way for the bill to receive royal assent by Monday, meaning it could become law before Parliament is suspended. Now, it comes after UK MPs handed Boris Johnson his third defeat in 2 days, Parliament backing a bill to prevent a no-deal Brexit, and in response, the Prime Minister put forward a motion calling for a snap general election on October the 15th. All that was again defeated by MPs. Let's take a listen to Boris Johnson and opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn sparring in Parliament earlier.
In my view, and the view of this government, there must now be an election on Tuesday, the 15th of October, and I invite the right honourable gentleman to respond, to decide which of us goes as Prime Minister to that crucial council on Thursday, the 17th of October.
Let this bill pass and gain royal assent, then we will back an election so we do not crash out with a no-deal exit from the European Union.
Well, France 24's Shirley Sitbon untangles what will happen next in the ongoing Brexit saga.
To block a no-deal Brexit, MPs are trying to pass a legislation banning it. They only have a few days to act because Parliament is suspended on Monday. So far, the House of Commons voted the bill on Wednesday, which has been passed to the Lords due to complete their own examination of the text on Friday. The bill will return to the House of Commons on Monday and land on the Queen's desk that same day. If the legislation passes and the government complies with it, it would ask the EU for a new delay. But Brussels has already said it will not renegotiate the agreement sealed with Theresa May. That's why the government is opposed to the law. It says it gives Brussels the power to decide. If Parliament fails to pass its legislation banning no deal, it can still try to stop no deal by setting up a no-confidence vote. If it passes, there could be a new government. That government can either push the no-deal option, it can try to improve the existing deal, cancel Brexit, or stage a new referendum. The Johnson government can also call early elections, hoping to either get a larger majority or wait out the process until Brexit takes effect on October 31st. Its motion has failed to get a two-thirds majority on Wednesday, but it can still call elections with a law that requires only a simple majority. The government's hope is to press the EU to accept new concessions, but Brussels too has shown determination. Hinting they're ready to face a no deal, its leaders released emergency disaster funds Wednesday to address the crisis that could follow.
Now, at least 20 people have been confirmed dead in the Bahamas from the devastation wrought by Hurricane Dorian. The US Coast Guard and Britain's Royal Navy airlifted survivors and ferried in emergency supplies. According to the UN, some 70,000 people on the Grand Bahama and Abaco Islands are in immediate need of aid. Brian Quinn has the latest.
Unprecedented devastation in the Bahamas. Entire neighborhoods wiped off the map in the wake of Hurricane Dorian. Helicopters from the US Coast Guard and the British Royal Navy airlifted injured survivors out on Wednesday. As Prime Minister Hubert Minnis thanked the international community for its support, and vowed to carry on.
Our response will be day and night, day after day, week after week, month after month, until the lives of our people return to some degree of normalcy.
In the capital, Nassau, tearful reunions as families found missing relatives. The United Nations now says some 70,000 people need immediate humanitarian aid. The Red Cross estimates that 13,000 homes have been either severely damaged or completely destroyed. Residents shocked at the level of damage.
Nothing's there anymore. There's no food stores, there's no marinas, there's no houses. 80% of the houses gone.
Hardest hit the northernmost islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama. Dorian struck there Sunday night with winds gusting over 350 kilometers per hour, tying the record for the strongest Atlantic hurricane to ever make landfall. Storm surges of up to 7 meters submerged entire houses as the storm lingered over the islands for 2 days before weakening and heading north. But Dorian is now regaining strength over the warm waters off the coast of the southeastern U.S. Over 2.2 million people have been ordered to evacuate in Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas.
Well, that was Brian Quinn reporting there, and now it's time for perspective, and it's one of the defining features of a human being, walking upright on 2 feet. But what's largely taken for granted by many is the subject of a fascinating new book by our next guest, neuroscientist Shane O'Mara, who's also Professor of Experimental Brain Research at Trinity College, Dublin. Now, his bestseller, In Praise of Walking, dives into the many benefits of taking a stroll. Now, thank you very much for being with us on the programme. Now, my first question really is, why do you describe in your book walking as a superpower? Why walking as opposed to, say, other forms of physical activity?
I describe walking as a superpower because it's our unique adaptation as humans. And if you consider how humans conquered the planet when we walked out of Africa 100,000 years ago, we literally did that. And we got ourselves all the way to South America. We got ourselves all the way to New Zealand. And we didn't do it using mechanized transport. We did it on foot, walking in small tribal and family groups.
Now, you support the idea that the brain evolved to support movement and that if we stop moving, it stops working as well. Then what do you make of this sort of societal shift in modern times of people becoming more sedentary, glued to their desks, glued to their phones, etc.? What does that mean for a society as a whole?
I think this we have to be fair to humans here. We evolved in a landscape that was resource poor. But at the same time, we evolved to walk considerable distances every day, anything up to 15, 18 kilometers a day, day in, day out. The problem is we have solved the problem of food access pretty much in the Western world, but we have not designed our societies to facilitate movement. And we know that lack of movement contributes to all sorts of problems in the brain and all sorts of problems in the body, from things like silting up the heart to respiratory problems to a series of malign changes in the brain.
Now, you say that one of the reasons why people move less is because cities and urban areas don't necessarily accommodate or prioritize pedestrians. You know, what do you think urban planners should do to get people out there walking?
I think this is a difficult question, and it's not easy to answer or to give the exact answer to. I think the problem comes down to how do we want to organize our towns and cities? You take the beautiful old medieval cities of Europe. We can't pour cars into them. They're not designed for cars. So I think what we have to do actually is engage in widespread car banning, which is something that people are very uncomfortable with. But I think this is in the end, removal of on-street parking and the simple removal of private cars from the cities is the best way forward.
Now, you've also said in your book that there are certain positive traits like openness and extroversion and just general agreeableness are linked to increased activity levels. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so we have very good data now on what happens to people who are sedentary and people who are active. And the study you're referencing is a wonderful study conducted in Wisconsin over the last 30 years. And what they've shown very, very nicely is that the people who move the least show the most malign changes in their personality. They become less agreeable, they become less open to experience, and they become more introverted. But for every level of movement above the most sedentary, you see positive aspects of personality being changed. People are more agreeable, which means they get on better together. They're more extroverted, so they're able to talk to each other, and they're open to the experience, which is a really important dimension of personality that feeds into creativity.
And speaking of creativity, you say as well that creativity gets a boost by physical activity. So if we were to, I don't know, do say 100 push-ups before solving a particularly difficult maths problem, would that improve our performance?
So I think, if we look at the lessons of the great artists and creatives over the years, what you see is many of them were really, really great walkers and walked considerable distances prior to engaging in creative acts. If I was to give you a very, very simple laboratory task, bring you into the lab and hand you something like a common household object like a paperclip and ask you to come up with novel uses for that object, you might come up with 10 or 20 such uses. But if I ask you to do a short walk first of about 10 minutes duration, either around a defined arena or on a treadmill, and then ask you to do the same task, your ability to generate ideas about doubles. So what we know is that a period of prior movement before engaging in creative work actually facilitates creative problem solving. So don't sit at your desk banging your head off your laptop. Get up, go for a walk, go for a stroll, come back, and then you'll find the problem much easier to tackle.
Now, I just wanted to ask, you've obviously researched this book before publishing, these stories. What for you has been sort of the surprise takeaway from all of your research?
I think the big surprise for me has been this realization that walking evolved in a social context. I think it's really quite remarkable that we focused very, very much on the idea of individual walking, how our spines changed, how the morphology of our foot changed, that kind of thing. But actually, for humans to have conquered the planet, we had to have learned and we had to have adapted to walking together in small groups, being able to pay shared social attention to each other. And walking has been sculpted by that experience. We're very, very good at paying attention to small groups. We're very good at paying joint attention to the horizon. And when we need to coordinate our behavior together, when the groups get a little bit bigger, we do things like sing, we chant, we tell stories, we march in formation. So humans are astonishingly good in a way that other species aren't at synchronizing their behavior and at synchronizing walking over very, very long distances.
And just finally, what's your advice for people who, like myself, don't move enough, are welded to their couch, just simply don't have the time or the energy after work, for example, to go out there and take a walk? What would you tell us to sort of motivate us to get out there?
So the first thing is that people underestimate consistently how good they feel after a walk. So if you take a walk, even if you don't feel like taking it, write down on a scale of 1 to 5 how you think you'll feel, and then write down when you come back how you actually do feel. And what you find is regularly, reliably, that people feel much better than they estimated they would feel. So keep that in mind. A walk will make you feel good. The other thing you should do is track the number of steps that you make every day, and have a target and have that as your kind of goad to action, whether it's 10,000 steps, 12,000, 8,000, it doesn't matter. Just have a goal and increment that goal. And then finally, if you're taking public transport or if you're driving, park further away, get off the train a little bit earlier. And if you're going out for lunch, walk to a further cafe so that you just add a little bit in everywhere you go. Don't take the elevator, take the stairs. Just simple changes like that can make a huge difference. But what we need is the other side. We need our urban planners to recognise that walking is our evolved form of movement and to recognise that in our urban centres.
Shane and Mara, I'll be taking your advice. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme today.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's take another look at our top stories today. And the UK moves a step closer to blocking a no-deal Brexit at the end of October. This after the House of Lords gives the green light for the bill to go through Parliament. And at least 80 people have been confirmed dead in the Bahamas after the devastation wrought by Hurricane Dorian. The UN says 70,000 people are in need of immediate humanitarian relief. Well, it's time now for today's focus, and we bring you a report from Afghanistan.